When we break it down, this is ratio 1, which is the ratio of the benefits we get from all the goods that we produce and maintain. And you can see, despite the fact that some of the goods that we consume have improved in quality, this ratio is going down. You might ask why. Well, it's largely because, remember, part of the benefit account includes some of those social and economic costs, such as cost of unemployment, cost of family breakdown, cost of crime. Well, we're working very hard to improve the quality of goods, which is probably having upward pressure on this ratio, but because we're having overwork, stress, family breakdown and so on, that's bringing it back down again. So this ratio is actually, to a large extent, for most of this period, now I've got to update this because this is mid-60s to mid-90s, but during that period, that's suggesting that for the majority of the time, the benefit curve was actually coming down, not going up for Australia. This is the second ratio. This is the ratio of the goods that we produce and maintain divided by the throughput. That gives us an idea, that ratio, of how much energy that because I use this as a proxy for throughput because it's a very difficult one to use, energy consumption, Australia's total energy consumption. And the reason being is that all economic processes require energy consumption, the consumption of energy. And if this ratio is going up, it means that we're able to maintain a particular amount of goods for a lower throughput of energy. So as they wear out and have to be replaced through further production, the amount of energy that we require to fuel this process, if the ratio is going up, is declining. So we're lowering that throughput in order to keep a certain amount of capital intact. Well, in fact, we're increasing it. We're actually requiring the consumption of more energy in order to maintain a given amount of human-made capital, not less. So for all this talk about improved efficiency, we haven't got it at all. This is the third one, which is throughput divided by natural capital. This is very deceptive because it includes both renewable and non-renewable natural capital. And the reason why this can look good is because you can bump up the throughput by just exploiting your non-renewable resources. So it looks like it's becoming more productive. You get more throughput for less. Look at the natural capital we've got left, not as much. Looks like it's going up. So what I've actually done, given that we ultimately have to rely upon renewable natural capital, I looked at the ratio of renewable energy that's being used to renewable natural capital. There is some increase. So that's perhaps a promising sign. And in fact, it indicates why aren't we using more renewable resources? Because we're actually increasing the productivity of it. So if we did rely upon renewable energy rather than non-renewable energy, then it's a good chance that we wouldn't have to exploit as much renewable natural capital anyway because it's becoming more productive. So why aren't we using this stuff? And then there's the last one, the exploitative efficiency ratio. That was natural capital divided by the costs. This indicates, this ratio, for any, say, hectare of forest that you might be logging, not necessarily clearing, logging, just selectively logging, how sensitive is the extraction process and how many, say, life support service or ecosystem services you are losing as a consequence. If this ratio is going up, it means that you're able to exploit a certain amount of natural capital and lose fewer of those critical services. If it's going down, it means you're losing more. So this suggests that we're losing more of our critical ecosystem services as we exploit a given amount of natural capital. So it would suggest that the cost curve is not in fact going down, that it perhaps is going up. So we've got the benefit curve for most of the period going down, the cost curve for most of the period going up, and we're growing the economy beyond the optimal macroeconomic scale. No wonder our GPI is on the decline. Yeah. Just very quickly, just one more point. All right, indication of the maximum sustainable scale. That was SS, right? So that the GPI is the S star. The indication of the maximum sustainable scale. Now, some people have a few problems with this indicator called the ecological footprint, but one way, I think it's quite useful. It's being refined just like the GPI, but one way to ascertain how big the economy is relative to the maximum sustainable scale is comparing ecological footprint with biocapacity. What is the ecological footprint? You've probably heard about it, but basically it represents, now given that we have to rely on renewable resources eventually, which means we've virtually got to grow them out of the ground, ecological footprint represents the area of land that would be required to provide the renewable resources necessary to maintain current consumption levels. So a lot of our current consumption depends upon the use of non-renewable resources. Let's imagine we have to rely entirely upon renewable resources. How much area of land would we require to be able to produce that? That's the ecological footprint. The biocapacity represents the area that we've got available to do it. If ecological footprint is greater than biocapacity, you've got an ecological deficit, and effectively it means your economy is beyond SS. If it's less than the biocapacity, it means you've got an ecological surplus and the economy is smaller than the SS, although, as I've got there, could still be possibly larger than S star. It could be somewhere between S star and SS. So even if you've got an ecological surplus, it doesn't mean the economy is a desirable scale. And of course, you've got an ecological balance when the two are the same. But given that an economic limit is likely to precede the ecological limit, if you are operating here, even though you're right on the ecological precipice, you're not likely to have the economy of the scale that is maximising our well-being, that's maximising the GPI. Just very quickly, you may have seen this. This is the ecological footprint versus biocapacity at the global level. This represents one Earth in terms of biocapacity. Here's the ecological footprint. So between 61 and about the mid-80s, the planet had an ecological surplus. Beyond the mid-80s, we've now got an ecological deficit. So we're in fact actually using about 1.2 Earths. Now you might say, how can you use 1.2 Earths when you've only got one Earth? But basically, what that means is that if you're using more than one Earth, you're depleting the stock of natural capital. You're eroding the stock of natural capital. And I might just leave it. I've got different, but that's... Let's just leave it at that, yeah, for a moment.
Could you just put it back on that previous?
Oh, sorry, this one here.
That's good.
Shall I start? Yep. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to move in the policy area to some extent. But again, I'll talk about a few conceptual issues first, because what I want to do is I want to talk about the limits of the role of the marketplace, because I think it's severely limited. But it's a very useful mechanism in certain areas. Okay, well, let's assume that we should make the transition to a steady state economy. I've convinced you that we've gone past the optimal scale, we're headed perhaps to going over the maximum sustainable scale, and we should make the transition to a steady state economy. I guess there's a couple of questions we need to ask. How do we make such a transition? And how can we continue to increase human well-being at that steady state economy to achieve sustainable development? Now, it's perhaps not absolutely critical as long as the GPI is not falling, but it'd be nice if the GPI on a per capita basis can rise, and I think it can for at least a period of time without having to grow the economy. Now, this is, again, a bit of a gross simplification, but I think policy, this is what some people, a few ecological economists have said, one in particular, Herman Daly. I don't know how familiar people are with the work of Herman Daly. But policy can basically be sorted into three main categories. One of them relates to the sustainable scale of the economy. And that's policy that ensures the throughput of matter energy, that input of resources and output of waste, is such that we adhere to those three sustainability precepts that I put up before. Right, so we need policy that makes sure it's the rate that resources go in and waste goes out doesn't violate those three principles. Then there's the distributional equity. That's ensuring the distribution of income and wealth is just and fair. Now this is a sort of broader area because you can include lots of things in here. It doesn't just have to be distribution of income and wealth. It can be policies related to access to health and education, even Aboriginal matters and the lack of services in Aboriginal communities. It can deal with equality of opportunity and so on. So this tends to be a broader sort of policy area, but I'm just sort of collapsing it all down into one policy area. And the other one is a thing called allocative efficiency. That's ensuring that the incoming resource flow, that's as the resources come into the economy, are allocated to the best possible product uses. Now, the best way to look at these or consider these three policy areas is to have another look at this again, something similar. Here I've got like the natural environment, the economy. Now, the first policy area, that throughput, making sure it's sustainable, is this resources in and waste out. We want that to be sustainable. We want to make sure it doesn't violate those three sustainability precepts.